Okay, Gretchen was kind enough to reach out to me and ask if, you know, I'd come and talk to you about something to do with my research. And originally, I think we were thinking that I would discuss my work. I'd written a book on Ellen Johnson Sirleaf, the first elected woman president on the continent of Africa, who led Liberia after civil war, and I wrote a book about her fairly recently. And then by the time we sort of got talking again, the world had sort of blown up, and I was ruminating on the similarities between South Africa and the United States. As someone who came to the States in the late 80s, I met an American in Cape Town, followed said American, still with said American, which is lovely. So, but I do remember arriving in this country and thinking, wow, you know, I recognize it. I recognize it in various ways. Anyway, so I asked Gretchen if she'd mind if I sort of ruminated on sort of similarities and differences that I saw between these two countries in a way that might help us just wrestle with some of what we are working through at the moment. So that's what I'm going to do today. I have a meeting at 1, and so I'll probably need to leave, you know, at 12:50 or something. But I'm here for a while. So so I prepared some slides, and really this is just to sort of contextualize some things, and then I would really look forward to talking with you. And thanks again to Gray. I was trying to remember where we actually met Gray. So I think it was, in fact, I couldn't remember, but I know I've engaged with you and been grateful to do so for a very long time. So here we are. Let me move that a little bit. So this is what I've sort of obviously done in real time, because it's grammatically incorrect. Anyway, settler societies after colonialism, South Africa and the United States is how I'm thinking about this. And let me see, that didn't work. Okay, so settler, the different terms for this, one is settler societies, another is settler colonies. And so I thought I would just frame the conversation this way, which is that settler colonialism and the societies that arise from it is a distinctive type of colonialism that functions through the violent domination of indigenous populations and the denial of their sovereignty, with a settler society that over time developed a distinctive identity and sovereignty. And settler colonial states would include Canada, the United States, Australia, and South Africa. And there's an emerging literature on settler societies, on settler colonialism. And this man, Lorenzo Veracini, is one of the preeminent scholars on this topic. And he says, settler colonialism makes sense, especially if it is understood globally, and that we live in a settler colonial global present. So that's, for some reason, that's all. I'll just do it the next way. Okay. Actually, I think I'll just go back before I go here. I think one thing I'd like to just say is that there are particular settler societies where you had a large, generally white population like Canada, United States, Australia, South Africa, who settle a country, dominate the local people, and then create sort of political systems that exclude those indigenous people. But I gave a talk in Finland a couple of years ago. I was asked to give a keynote, and I did a sort of more personal story about being South African and things. But I did point out that, you know, virtually every country in the world has some form of colonial history lurking in the background. And the Finns, who I think of themselves as, I had the best time there, I have to say, but, you know, very democratically oriented, very, just a really democratically oriented, egalitarian society. When I pointed out that their relationships with the Sami, who are then indigenous societies living in the north who've been colonized by the Finns and the Swedes, there was definitely a rustle in the audience when I mentioned that. You know, so while I think there's something specific to the kind of settler societies we're talking about in Canada, United States, Australia, and South Africa, I think virtually every country in the world would do well to consider their history and indeed their present. So I think clearly South Africa and the United States have some similarity here. And then among those settler societies or settler colonial systems, there are also ones that specifically also depended to some extent on formal slavery. And in that respect, the United States and South Africa are really quite similar. The patterns of enslavement were similar in that both the United States and South Africa had smaller slaveholding economies. I mean, very, very important economically, but the nature of the plantation systems were intimate, relatively small numbers of enslaved people. The reproduction of the slave societies in both cases, which emerged, at least in South Africa in the 18th century, depended indeed on rape and the importation of people from other parts of South Africa, so of Africa in general. And so, unlike, for example, slavery in the Caribbean or Brazil, which had huge plantation economies and different systems, but there is something quite similar in the experience of enslaved people and indeed slaveholders in the United States and South Africa, which I think leads to some sort of interesting similarities in various ways. And so I think there is a reason why the United States and South Africa have in fact been compared, you know, their history. In fact, I've thought when I stop doing this, I'd love to teach a history class on this. And there are some books that I'm going to recommend at the end, but that there are sufficient commonalities in South Africa and the United States to have, I think, a meaningful conversation about similarities and differences. But they both have origins in immigration, in colonization, in the dispossession of indigenous people from their land, histories of enslavement and slavery, and I think the rise of white supremacy. And I say white supremacy both here, I'm thinking of it both as a kind of South Africa certainly had an ideology of white supremacy, but also just more generally as a kind of a society that came to, you know, just assume the norms of, you know, a kind of a European, British, in South Africa, British and Dutch sensibility where it became the norms of the society. So there I'm really talking about kind of structures of politics, structures of thought, culture, and in some cases you of course also have these groups that actively see that as a political project. So it seemed to me that in the States, and as I said, you know, I said to Gray, I'm going to do the best I can in this COVID moment. Please excuse the lack of polished presentation and everything else, but anyway, so it seems to me that America has a kind of double helix, the DNA of the United States, of racism and the promised land, which is what makes it such a compelling place to be. More so, I think, than South Africa, where racism was so profound for so long. Not that there wasn't resistance and things like that, which I'll talk a bit about, but I think in a way from the beginning, the USA has held this promise of being a place that could be a place for everybody. And so, and I think it's that promise of the American dream, and that it doesn't really matter what background you come from or what class you come from, this idea, which we know has not been realized in practice, but this idea of the promised land, I think is exactly what has inspired generations of immigrants to come to this country. And I think that's a real promise. But the other side of that DNA is racism, as I say here, rooted in the dispossession of indigenous people, colonialism, slavery, and as we're seeing every day, continued structural violence against Black Americans and Native Americans right to today. And so it seems to me that the United States has to reckon with its origins and its history before it can reach the promised land, really, although that you might always be aspirational. But I think we need a new DNA in America. And but we can't get there if we don't address history. So it's in that respect that I wonder whether, and I wonder more than anything, whether South Africa can really offer us a way forward for the United States to how to really wrestle with its history. So just to go into a little more detail about South Africa, it is also, as I was saying, a settler colony with both genocide, frontier wars, and slavery in its history. You know, the indigenous people, the Khoi and the San, and various African polities were obviously there. And the Dutch came in 1652, establishing a way station on the way to India to fuel their ships because sailors were dying of scurvy. They established a fort, they did trading relationships with the Khoi and the San. And then soon some of those sailors thought, no, we'd rather just stay in the Cape, which is truly the most beautiful place in the world. I think officially, I've been a lot of places, it remains spectacular. I can show you a picture just now towards the end if you want to see. But very shortly thereafter, in about 1658, some of the company officials of the Dutch East India Company, the VOC in Dutch, decided no, we'd rather stay at the Cape. So they stayed at the Cape, but of course they didn't want to do the labor themselves. So slavery was instituted, and slavery, the Dutch had a policy across their empire of not enslaving people indigenous to an area, because of course then they could collaborate and consolidate resistance with other people. And so they always brought people from other places. And that's how in South Africa today you have people descended from various societies in the Dutch period, from Malaysia and various places in the Dutch East Indies. And then under the British, who came in 1806, they brought people from the western east coast of Africa to be enslaved in South Africa. So there's a very diverse group of people who can find themselves descended from people who were brought as enslaved people. Like America also, of course, as I was describing the nature of slavery in South Africa, and it was really concentrated down near Cape Town and the regions near there, the slave population did become self-reproducing, in part, really, mainly through, at first, slaveholders raping slave women. In the early days, some slaveholders freed enslaved women and married them, and their children were then brought into the category of what became white. And so whereas other children, as the centuries went off, were excluded from whiteness and fell into emerging categories of, to use a South African term, it's not a term that's acceptable in America, it is a term that is used in South Africa, so I'll put it in quotes, colored. To be colored in South Africa was in general to say that one of your forebearers, probably your through the maternal line, was had been enslaved. South Africa, like America, also has this deeply, is in many ways, enslavement and slavery is part of the family story of America as it is in South Africa. And just quickly to say that at the ending of apartheid in 1994, around that time I was doing work in the archives in South Africa in Cape Town, and people were coming into the archives to find their, to do their genealogy, and there were people who thought of themselves as white, had supported apartheid, who were discovering that if they went far back enough, they had a black ancestor or an enslaved ancestor from the Dutch East Indies or Mozambique, and were having to really not necessarily reconcile, but recognize that the whiteness was a construct as much as in South Africa, quote unquote, coloredness was a construct. Anyway, so there's some similarities there. Also, we had, clearly in South Africa, racial segregation, violation of people's rights, apartheid. And one thing that I think is not often thought about, maybe quite sufficiently in doing comparisons, is that both the United States and South Africa forced indigenous people in the South African case, that would be African South Africans who would speak languages like Zulu, Xhosa, Igama, Lam, Pamela, Indingu, Ikapa, that's Xhosa with a click. but in South Africa, indigenous people would be people who would be today classified primarily as African. In the United States, obviously, it would be people who classified as either American Indians or Native Americans. And in both cases, America and South Africa, land was taken away from those groups, and people were put into what in this country is called reserves, and what in the South African case was called homelands. And I just thought I'd show you a quick map so you can get a sense of things. So these are the various acts: 1913 Lands Act, then a policy called separate development under apartheid, and then homelands. And these little colored bits here are what were designated as homelands under apartheid. And the conceit was that if you spoke Xhosa, you had to go and live in either this area, Ciskei or Transkei. If you spoke Zulu, you had to go and live in KwaZulu. If you spoke Venda, you came up here, etc., etc. But of course, none of these lands were consolidated, because the point of these lands was that they were not to be on good land. So if you drive through the Ciskei even today, or the Transkei, which are now incorporated as part of South Africa, they're no longer independent homelands as a result of the end of apartheid, you can see the differences. They are poorly, too many people put on them, so they're very eroded, and it wasn't good land to begin with, because if it was good land, the whites took it. And that's a whole course. But nonetheless, under apartheid from 48, well, actually starting much earlier, around the 20s, but certainly under apartheid from 48, Black South Africans only had political rights in these homelands. And if they wanted to be working in the Cape or anywhere in this kind of beige area, which was white controlled, they could only go there if they were working for a white person or on the mines. And the only way they were allowed to travel from the Transkei or Venderland was they had to have a pass. And that's how the pass system came about. Was it there were a whole structure of racial oppression organized around stopping Africans and seeing if they had the right to be in a white area or not. Anyway, another story. But so you can see that there's this dispossession of people's land. People who lived here were forced to go and live there, etc., etc. But you also, here's the Native American lands. These are not all of them, because as I say, 23,000 acres are omitted. Like, there are small communities up here whose lands are not identified on this map. But it is interesting to see people who used to live here, indeed on the land in which we're, sitting. Well, for those of us in Atlanta, that there was a similar dispossession of indigenous people and a removal. So there are deep histories here that I think, again, make the comparison somewhat relevant. They also, on the other flip side, have both US and South Africa have civil rights movements. The African National Congress was founded in 1912. We had a Black Power movement in the 70s. And I have an op-ed that is sort of floating out there. I'm trying to get it published. So far, no luck. But anyway, I'm going to try. And what I'm saying is, what's really interesting about the States is that for many years, the anti-apartheid movement looked to the States for, was inspired by the States. The civil rights movement was inspired by, the African National Congress was inspired by the civil rights movement here. Black Power was inspired by the emergence of Malcolm X and people like that in the United States. So for many years, South Africans, we looked to America. And so I remember when I was in college in the 80s and involved, as a student, I remember Wesleyan University was one of the first universities to do sanctions against the apartheid government. And I just remember being so inspired that this college in America, that the students were building shacks and standing up for, justice. And it was just wonderful. America, living outside of America, we saw much more the promise of America and the way that people were fighting for their civil rights. And now I think it's time for us in this country to look actually to South Africa. I think South Africa has led us in various ways now. So, Mandela was freed in 1990, democratic elections in 94. And I do want to point out here, though, why I think it's so important that America wrestle with its history and its obligations to one another, is that here you see Black South Africans are in the vast majority in South Africa, some 79% of the population. And so when we were engaged in anti-apartheid work or whatever, one had a sense in the 80s that time and history were on your side, that South Africa was the last colonial, really the last colony for all intents and purposes in Africa to fall. And you just knew, I mean, there was no way that a white minority government was going to really be able to continue in South Africa. And so you felt that, as I say, you know, history was on the side of justice. Here, it's I think, it's going to take will, because here the demographics are almost reverse. You know, whites make up some 73% of the population as of the 2017 census. So I think there's something, I've really been thinking about this, and I think there's something more terrifying about racism in this country, because racism in South Africa, and it's not about the nature of the racism, because apartheid was a different brutal state that was dead. It was brutal precisely because whites were in such a minority. So apartheid South Africa was a brutal, horrific, torturous state. So I'm trying to think but there's something about racism here where it's against people who, at least at the moment, are in the minority, unless there's broad consolidations across different identity groups. It is really terrifying, I think. I think it's terrifying. So a way forward, and I'm sort of getting towards the end, I think. So as you probably all know, South Africa had a Truth and Reconciliation Commission, and it was inaugurated by Archbishop Desmond Tutu, who was at Emory in the 1990s on a sabbatical, I gather. And he and others thought it was really important to help South Africa come to some reckoning with this terrible past, in part because the apartheid state under the National Party had been so brutal, and had people had disappeared, they died, and their families had no idea where their children were, or their fathers, or their mothers. And so it was thought that it was really important for society to be able to move forward, that the families of victims, or the victims themselves, have a chance to say how terrible things had been for them, and possibly to learn what had happened to those family members and friends who had disappeared and no one knew where they were. And so the TRC was organized around, and it's been criticized for this, you know, one can always criticize, but it's been organized around this of an idea of a kind of confessional, a kind of a Christian confessional, where someone would come as a perpetrator and tell their story, and that something about being together in a confessional space would heal. So there were victims, so people wrote in thousands of documents, and out of those were selected particular stories and experiences that needed to be lifted up in public. So there were a whole series of public hearings at various parts of South Africa, and they were televised, and every Sunday there was a kind of a summary of the week's hearings. And victims got to stand up in front of a group of TRC counselors who came from religious groups and civic organizations, and say what had happened to them and get to be validated. And it was incredibly moving. And what was, I think, so there was that. And then on the other hand, the opportunity was given to perpetrators, members of the police, of the army, the security forces, to come and say what they had done and to confess to killings and brutality. And one of the most controversial parts of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in South Africa was that no one was required to apologize. And the thinking behind that was, as Archbishop Desmond Tutu said, was there was incredible need for families to know where their loved ones were buried. That not all, but you know, 99% of the people, of the victims who were killed were Black. And in African communities, knowing where your ancestors are buried, being able to bury your loved ones in the ground, to say certain prayers so the ancestors can look after them, is crucial, critical, and the thing that is required. And for many people, they didn't know what had happened to their children, so they couldn't bring closure. They couldn't release the dead person to become part of the ancestors. And so the thought was that if you demanded that people like the security police apologize for their actions, you were unlikely to get anybody to come and tell their story. And also it was understood that if someone really, really came and told the truth as a perpetrator, they could ask for amnesty. So they were known as amnesty hearings. And the perpetrators came forward, and the only criteria was that they had to tell the truth, and they had to demonstrate that what the violence they'd engaged in was part of a politically motivated, under the rules of the state, under the rules of apartheid. It couldn't be that I hated someone and wanted to take his wife and I killed him under the guise of something. It had to be that you were ordered, or that you felt that it was your quote unquote Christian duty under apartheid to kill a communist or something like that. But no apologies were necessary. So if you look at the videos, and they're on the web if you want to look at them, they are chilling. Most of these perpetrators feel no guilt, as far as you can tell. They do not offer an apology. It's really quite chilling. But those were the components of the TRC. And there were also plans for reparations, which are incomplete, and there's a group that is trying to sue the state to make sure they get reparations. I think it's dying a slow death. But I think, you know, whatever and again, I teach a class in this, and there are lots of backs and forths about, you know, the benefits or challenges of the TRC. But I think one of the benefits of the TRC is it lifted it up through these hearings, through all the documentation. It made the violence of the apartheid regime absolutely undeniable. And I see that Trevor Noah said that cell phones in this country are serving the same sort of purpose. That, you know, when you see George Floyd being killed in the way he was, and the killing of so many other, it's undeniable. You can see something wrong. And so what the TRC did for South Africa was whites who'd gone la 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 la, and lived in, I mean, I grew up white, you know, upper middle class. I grew up in a neighborhood that looks honestly like Druid Hills. It was Houghton in Johannesburg, and in fact about a block away from where Nelson Mandela went to live after he became president. So, you know, a very nice, wealthy white suburb looked identical to this. And many whites life was like that. They had black servants, they just proceeded, etc., etc. So the TRC, I think, at least for white South Africans could no longer say that they didn't know, or that they weren't in some way complicit, or it did that work. And it did some work for those families who were now able to know what had happened to their loved ones. And I have a friend and colleague who is still 20-something years later. She leads a team that go to burial sites and I'm trying to think, I don't remember exhume the bones and return them to the families. And that work is ongoing 20 years later. Anyway, in the USA, there have been some attempts at a TRC, and the one I know most is the 2005 Greensboro Truth and Reconciliation Commission, which was private, and it brought together people from various groups in Greensboro and the Black and the white community to kind of talk about and try and reconcile over a killing. And I can talk more about that if you'd like, in '79. And there are various sort of local restorative justice sort of reconciliation groups, I think, working in California, for example, but we haven't had a big, you know, a national TRC. And we're clearly, you know, not doing what, you know, other countries with difficult paths have done. You know, I think of Germany, for example. And so to return to the double helix, you know, I wonder, you know, what would a reconciliation look like in America? I'm sure you all saw this really compelling piece in yesterday's New York Times on My Body as a Confederate Monument, where the author Caroline Randall Williams, she's at Vanderbilt, writes about the deep familial entanglements of enslavement and race and rape and the present, and that she has a really amazing paragraph where she talks about how, you know, she is half white. If you know, presume you did her, she is half white, and yes, yet she has no white relatives in living memory in her family. And yet, if you go back far enough, there is, you know, there are whites in her family, but the whites in her family were slaveholders. And what does that mean, that she has no white family in her own generation, but nonetheless, if you looked hard, and, you know, there is white family there, but through the exclusions of race in America, they are not there. And it's true. If you haven't seen it, it's a really amazing piece. So that's where I sort of ended up, just sort of wrestling with, you know, what would a Truth and Reconciliation Commission look like in America? Are we so decentralized that that's almost impossible? Would it need to be only in the South? Is the North really as, I think the North has some things to own too. Where would one start? And then I thought I'd just give you some reading recommendations if you're interested in learning more. And George Fredrickson, who was a professor, I want to say Wisconsin, but I'm not quite sure. Anyway, he wrote this sort of definitive book for a long time called White Supremacy, a Comparative Study of American and South African History, I think in the late 70s. It's dated now, but it's a good place to start. And then Virginie is the man who's written about the settler colonial present. There's a really interesting book by Penny Edmonds, who I know, where she's looking at the way that various communities have tried to reconcile through kind of performative performances. She includes the States, New Zealand and Australia. And then for South Africa, of course, if you haven't read Long to Freedom, I really recommend it. That's Nelson Mandela's autobiography, and it gives you a history of South Africa. He was born in 1918. Died in 2013, and really he just gives you, it's a fantastic history of the 20th century in South Africa through his remarkable life. And then Steve Biko, I Write What I Like, is a really important book thinking about Black power and identity in South Africa. And so there we are. So those were my ruminations. So I'd be delighted to converse with you on any topic. Yeah.
And so I'd like to comment, just as always, if you want to make a comment or ask a question, click on the participants list, and at the bottom is a blue hand. Click on the blue hand, and that will signal Pamela that she can call on you to talk.
And I'm also happy to, you know, if you want to ask me about myself, I can talk about that too. Vernon, yes.
Yes, thank you, Pam, for this. Just so you know, in 1996, I was invited to go to South Africa, and then was there until 2004 as visiting professor. And what you're talking about seems so right and right on target. What I notice at present is that it seems to me attempts to try to get something like truth and reconciliation is being crowded out by talk about immigration. And I wonder if you can help us think about the relation of current movements of large numbers of people into new nations, both in Europe and the United States, sort of all over the world, in Norway, Sweden, you just name the place, as the overlay of these settlement colony nations that have the long histories. So there's the long history, and now there's the overlay of the intense immigration at the present, in our present decades. Can you help us think about that and how truth and reconciliation concerning the past is related to and competing with immigration fears and concerns in the present?
That's a fantastic question that, woo, I'll try. And I mean, I think this is a conversation, so if, you know, I would say welcome anybody's input. I think the thing that my immediate reaction is that the United States, you know, and I've been here so long, I have many we's, but I feel very much like it's my we as well, even though my history is not quite as deep in this country, is it's always been overlaid by immigration and racism and things like that. And if you think about the waves, there might be something distinctive in our time I don't know enough, but there might be something distinctive in our time about the incredible numbers of people. But we've always been a society of immigrants. That's both our promise and our problem. And the way that different immigration groups from different countries have been incorporated has also been a story of race. And so, you know, there's some fabulous book about how the Irish became white. And, you know, I was talking to a neighbor down the road who's her parents are her grandparents from Greece, and she was saying that when her mother arrived in Atlanta whenever, and they lived somewhere near, her parents were both doctors and researchers at Emory. She said the neighborhood, which was I think North Druid Hills neighborhood in the 60s, when they arrived and bought a house there, the neighborhood wanted to know if being Greek was actually white. Were they white enough? And that they came from the wrong side of Europe, and that really they could, you know what I mean? So I think there's always been this question of, are you white enough? Can you be absorbed? Who can be absorbed? That is part of that deep history as well. And even I think some of the conversations about, well, yes, but today it's all this illegal immigration. I was reading something the other day, said that so many people who arrived on Ellis Island didn't have papers, so this idea of a legal, orderly, it was orderly in the sense that they arrived at Ellis Island, I guess, but so I would say it's not either or. It's that if we think of it in a sense that these are the same conversation about who belongs and who doesn't, and the maybe one of the issues that comes to the surface today gets reflected as a kind of language debate about, you know, the people who are coming from Central America don't speak English, and so they're not quite us, etc., etc. But I think at the heart of it is America for everybody?
Yes. And
who is that, or not?
Right.
But I think that's just my instinctive response to you. I don't feel like I know enough about any of those topics to really weigh in. I see Denise. Denise?
Yes. Oops.
Hi.
Am I? No.
No, yeah, you're there.
Unmute. Okay. So just a comment on that. I think that this idea about talking about immigration, which the president always wants to do, is simply a distraction.
Yes.
It once again prioritizes white people over the central problem here, which is Black people. And it leaves out the discussion of the indigenous people, as well as the Africans who were imported.
Yes.
And then, you get into an argument about who's white now and who wasn't white now. And in some ways, it does spill over in narratives about how Asians have been treated, the Chinese, for instance, and the Japanese. But keep in mind, as we bleed over into reparations, the Japanese did in fact receive reparations,
exactly.
right? And yet somehow it's terrible if we think about reparations for Black people who had a much larger and longer history. Okay, having said that, I really wanted to talk more about truth and reconciliation in this country, because I think it has to be local in some ways to deal with different entities. So as we look at, Tulsa, for instance,
Yes.
they are trying to do the kind of truth and reconciliation. And there, once again, the issue of lost ancestors and trying to reclaim bodies has become important because of all the mass graves that they just put people in, and people are still trying to find their relatives. But if you look at things like the Equal Justice Initiative,
yes.
Where when they do a dedication for a marker for a lynching, they always invite the law enforcement in that location to come and apologize, or at least acknowledge the role of the law enforcement in the lynching, whether it was law enforcement itself or how they augmented it or how they were part of the Klan and so forth. They have only gotten a response from one law enforcement person. Every other time they've invited someone, they've all declined to participate, right? But so if you think of the number of lynchings, and we don't know how many, all of them, because they haven't been recorded, 4,000, let's say. If you think of all of those settings, and the Equal Justice Initiative does a tremendous job in finding these histories, right?
Yeah.
All of those settings could begin their own truth and reconciliation process about that initially and expand out. So I think there are many opportunities. I think the country lacks the will to do any of them.
Yeah. Yes, and I wonder. I love the Equal Justice Initiative, and I hadn't thought about. I think that's a really interesting way forward, though. To have reconciliation truth commissions around each lynching memorial. I mean, one has to start somewhere,
right?
And I think so I don't know whether that would help a national reckoning, but I saw a Facebook post that was really excellent. I wanted to try and share it outside of Facebook, because anyway, about a man talking about Willy Brandt, who was the chancellor in West Germany, and I can't remember when he did this, but he actually grew up and left. He grew up in Nazi Germany and left to be a dissenter and was hunted down by the Nazis and everything. So he was on, quote unquote, the right side of history. Nonetheless, when he was chancellor, and he went to, I read it so quickly, I can't remember. But nonetheless, he went to some memorial service for the Holocaust. And despite himself personally having done the right thing during the Nazi era, he knelt down and apologized on behalf of Germany. And this man, he's a journalist, was writing about the incredible significance that had for people who had gone through the Holocaust and their descendants. And it wasn't about him personally. He understood the significance of a formal, deeply held and demonstrated apology. And I mean, as you say, I don't know if the will is there in this country, and maybe something, like what you've just suggested around sites, lynching sites would help nudge people to that, but I think it has to be that as well. At some point, I think there has to be a national apology. And I suspect the reason people don't want to do it is precisely because it's actually intimate.
Mm-hmm.
It's right here. Yeah.
But I do think you can see like descendants of people whose statues are being torn down, saying, "Oh yeah, I agree, go do it," you know, or the response about Woodrow Wilson. "Oh yeah, no, that's who he was. Let's just let go of that."
Yeah.
So I do think there is this impulse in some whose name has been tagged to come up and say, "You're right. I understand. I want to take responsibility by saying we shouldn't be honoring those things."
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I feel like I've got whiplash at the moment because on the one hand, this is such a horrific, I mean, really, I find it a horrific moment on one level. On the other hand, I think, I feel like we might be in a place where America is actually, like the better America, and our youth are saying, you know, this is not the America we want to be. We actually want to be a different America. And that is incredibly hopeful, but I don't know.
I'll believe it when I see it.
Well, exactly, that's why one can't completely, you know. Talia Farrow, if I'm saying your name right? Yes, okay. I think it's okay. Hi.
I want to make a statement and then I have a question.
Sure.
And I think in our history, world history, a lot of prisoners from England were sent to Australia. And a lot of French Canadians were sent to Louisiana.
My husband is descended from them, yes.
Right. And a lot of people from Europe came to this country for religious freedom and other things. And then a number of Africans were forced to come to this country and other countries as slaves. The question I have has to do with New Zealand. How did New Zealand, with a Maori population, avoid what happened in Australia? Get so close to Australia.
So again, I know, you know, about that much, but my family actually, I've got family who live in New Zealand, so I actually go there before COVID once a year. I think New Zealand is interesting because Australia was a convict settlement, and so a convict settlement and a more brutal colonial experience, I guess. The immigrants who went to New Zealand went out, were generally from Scotland, were very, very poor, and some of them were sort of sent as orphans. It was a very a more quote unquote minor program in the history of British imperialism, and so there wasn't the same kind of investment by imperial authorities in New Zealand that you got in other places, and thus for good and ill, but probably for good. I mean, for in terms of not for good for the settlers, but you know, good for the history of New Zealand. What I know is that very early on there were also stronger Maori societies that were fairly powerful and had, you know, various rights, and the societies were cohesive, and the settlement, because it was not a priority of the British, was much less supported by the British. So very early on, there was a kind of a recognition that there had to be more quote unquote accommodation on the part of settlers. They did, and it's not like I certainly don't want to indicate that colonialism in New Zealand was hunky-dory. It wasn't, if you know, but there were recognitions of Indigenous rights. And so there was a Treaty of Waitangi that recognized Maori sovereignty in various places. And I think what is different when I go, so I'm less certain about the history, but I can tell you I visit New Zealand a lot. And what I'm struck by, in contrast to many other countries, is under various different governments in New Zealand in the last, I'd say 20 years. And I think Jacinda Ardern is just like the best, but they have made a real effort to change their cultural norms from being an outpost of the British Empire, drinking tea and cooking sausage, to a much more multicultural society. And so even if you get on an Air New Zealand plane, for example, minor things that seem minor, but I think are significant symbolically, they now will speak Maori. And so it's kia ora. Aratoa is the name of New Zealand. I'm sure I'm not saying that right, but they're beginning to use Maori names in terms, in welcomes, in goodbyes. You can learn Maori in the schools. There are one of the first things that Jacinda did when she became Prime Minister was to go to the leading Maori elders and pay her respects. And so there's a whole and I think she understands in particular the significance of the symbolic, to get back to the earlier point. So I think it's got to do part, and you know, also New Zealand had sheep. That's what it could offer the world. I mean, it doesn't have gold, it doesn't have diamonds, unlike South Africa. You know, if you teach, when I teach African history, there's a term called the resource curse. You know, so Nigeria, Ghana, South Africa, the Democratic Republic of Congo are incredibly wealthy in minerals, and those have made them ripe for various sorts of exploitation. New Zealand is gorgeous and has sheep. You know, so I think that is also, yeah. Anyway, so that's a kind of roundabout answer. I don't see at the moment any blue hands. Oh, I do. McKay. Hi.
Unmute. Okay, am I there?
Yes,
okay,
you are.
Good. I had my blue light, my hand up, and then I put it down, and then
Well, thank you. Well, now
yeah, so there's lots and lots of things to consider. I always thought it was interesting the way to tell the difference. The big difference in Australia and New Zealand was that, yes, they do have Rotorua, they have the mountains named, all the native names, and you go to Australia and it's the Great Sandy Desert and the Great Snowy Mountains. Clearly not being sensitive, and I think the Maoris were really quite fierce. And they commanded a fair amount of respect too, and that made a difference. I was this is coming away from there and talking about Germany and reparations. I was on a cruise of one of the first cruises we did when I retired was a riverboat down from Amsterdam to somewhere, hell, I mean, it was through the Rhine, the Main, and the Danube. And one of the things when we got to Nuremberg was that young people came onto the boat to talk to us about the World War II and about the Nazis. And they made the point that they could not get their parents to talk about it, or their grandparents in many cases. They simply would not discuss it. It was not up for anything. And it was up to the young people who decided to start talking about it, making reparations, coming to talk to tourists. We went to the place where the trials were held. We went to see where Hitler had his big group things with all the Nazi salutes and everyone there, and which is now a parking lot, a very large parking lot, and has been broken up. And that was very good, I think, for us to see. And when talking about the reconciliations and lynchings and other things, it might be that it's going to start with teachers and working with young people and having them demand to know these things. I don't think it is necessarily going to come from older people, and that it's okay for it to start with young people. And they should not be afraid to stand up and say, you know, we can find out as much about this and maybe even know more. And that might be a good place to start. And
I think that's a really really good point. And to some extent, we're seeing that in real time now. I just put in the chat, if anybody has not seen this film, it's called The Nasty Girl, or The Nasty Girl. And it came out about 20 years ago now. And it's based on a true story about a young woman in, I think it's a small town in Bavaria somewhere, in the 70s or 80s, maybe the 80s. It's just 50, maybe the 70s. Anyway, she's a very good student. She's in high school, and she decides to do a research project for high school on the history of her village during the Nazi era. And her village has always been like, you know, that they were not part of the baddies, they were great, and which is why she felt she could do it, to show how one German town did fine. And of course, what happens is the more and more and more she investigates, it turns out, in fact, there was what they called a, you know, like an immigration camp or something like that in the corner of the town on the outskirts. Well, of course, it turned out that it was a concentration camp, and that in fact the leading Roman Catholic priest of her parents' generation had in fact been complicit. And then it turned out the judges, and you know, the more she investigated, it just the whole edifice of we're great people falls apart, and the complexities of collaboration and worse become apparent. And she ends up having to she's run out of town because of she goes around doing oral histories, and she is run out of town because of this. It was a I think it won sort of awards. It's very a mainstream film. It's just like a, you know, the kind of film you'd go and see in the movie theater. It's very good. It's really very good. And it's about, I think, again, back to that really excellent piece in the New York Times yesterday. It's about, in societies like ours, the more you unravel, the closer we all become genealogically, and the more the distance is really a pretense, and that we are there's much more there that we have to reconcile. I mean, binds us in all sorts of ways, both in the terms of bondage and others. One thing, just, you know, back to the idea of the local, I do worry sometimes, though, well, not that the North, because these histories of race and immigration and discrimination have multiple origins in a way in America. I would hate to have something where we only reconcile around one issue, because I think the North, so my spouse is writing, you might invite him at some point, he's writing a big book about the violent origins of the modern world. And so he's been doing a lot of research on New England. And while there wasn't a lot of slavery in the North, there was slavery, but while there was not a lot, he said the economic connections between like Massachusetts and Connecticut and the Pilgrims, literally the Puritans, and the Quakers to slavery is absolutely unbelievable. You know, so that and again, that's maybe is the point of that is the modern world. But I think we also need to think about, you know, for example, all the work that's being done on racial and indigenous disparities around COVID, you know, and the work that's coming out to see how indigenous communities, Native American communities are suffering terribly on, and to learn, I should have known this, but I didn't, to learn there's no running water on many of the Native American reservations.
Yeah.
I mean, what? So there seems to be a lot for us all to wrestle with. but I think you also have to, I actually think starting that, your idea, Denise, about starting with, because also the Equal Justice Initiative is on it. I mean, they know how to organize, they know how to advocate, they are recognized as an honorable group. I think that is something to really think about as a place to start, and then to sort of build out. Yeah. Gretchen.
Yes, hi. We've touched on the several of the settler societies you mentioned in the beginning. I wanted to ask about Canada. I mean, yes. Certainly in the last 3.5 years, many of us have been heard to say, I'm going to Canada, you know. What do we find when we get there? It's my impression they're doing much better than we are, reconciling somehow what's been done with indigenous populations, but what's true about the sort of modern repercussions of their history of colonialism?
Well, I think so. I think it helps that they have if I may, a really rather gorgeous and photogenic leader. I mean, he gets away with a lot just by standing there, I think. But there is well, I think Canada is also having to confront its past, because I think for a long time Canada was seen as, you know, colonialism light, a bit like New Zealand, I guess, you know, that Canadians weren't as bad, that they had really good manners, and that they hadn't done what, you know, what America did. But, you know, the more you dig there too, the indigenous communities, they're just terrible inequities there too. I mean, really, really bad. And in particular, the violence, there's an emerging stream of research on the violence, police violence, particularly against Indigenous women, and histories of rape. And there's a really excellent researcher called, I'm going to see if I can get her name right, I'm putting it in the chat, Shireen Razek, who is she's a professor of education and communications, and she's written some really excellent books on race, sort of indigeneity, and particularly Indigenous people in urban spaces, that they don't belong, you know, they're not seen to belong to be in the appropriate place if they're not on the reservation, and how they get subject to a kind of settler violence. So there's that. That said, there has been a Truth and Reconciliation Commission, and there have been formal attempts to work through some of these issues. I know I was at a conference a few years ago in Canada around these kind of things, actually, and spoke to a couple of the people who were involved. And, you know, the closer you look, the less perfect any of these things seem. But I would say at least Canada is trying. But I think I think these conversations get to scary places for those in power, because a bit like the defund the police, can you reform a system which was actually started? It was started, you know, John Stewart, I thought, had a really excellent point, that the police in this country are like a border patrol, an internal border patrol, policing boundaries and enacting violence. And can we have a just police system in a system which actually started under slavery precisely to act like slave patrols, or can it be reformed? And I think that, you know, that's, I guess, up for debate. But I think the more we try to address issues, the scarier it's going to be for those in power, because the issues are really fundamental to the fundamental structures of these societies. And so what does it mean? Like in Canada, they've had a Truth and Reconciliation Commission, but what does it really mean? Should it be that Canada should say, we're really sorry we took your lands and you can have them back, which leaves you with, like, where? Or, I mean, I just think these are challenging issues for any society. And I think which is one of the I'll just end with the criticism, the TRC, is the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in South Africa has been roundly criticized. It's much more popular outside of South Africa than in. And in South Africa, it is roundly criticized, both for its kind of Christian orientation in a multi-religious country, but also because it only would look at violence under apartheid. It did not look at the history of dispossession, of slavery. It didn't take sexual violence against women seriously. In fact, it actively didn't. There was a report that they chose not to publish, etc., etc., etc. And so the criticism of the TRC in South Africa is it kept it so nicely narrow that it didn't actually reconcile some of the bigger issues for South Africa, which is around land, the dispossession of 70% of the population from the land on which their grandparents were born. And so that is a seething issue that democracy has not solved. Yeah. Okay, maybe one more question. Viola. Viola?
She's there, I think. Tiny?
Here. Yeah, I'm here.
Hi.
Hi. Of course, we have veered away from Germany, but I'd just like to add two more things
Sure.
to what both you said and Mary Kay did. First of all, Willy Brandt. Willy Brandt went to Poland. It was part of his his Ostpolitik, and as you said, it was a monumental moment, and in fact, it had not been planned. It was something that came truly from his heart, and that's what added a lot to the sincerity and the genuine feeling, and that opened a lot. Germany had reparations in its initial making of the federal government. It was part of the, part of forming the government. So there was an opening. Of course, it's never enough and it's never right. But, and then the third little thing perhaps is there was an NBC TV series called The Holocaust. And at the time, I remember being absolutely aghast because it was so manipulated. You know, it would go a little way and then, of course, it would break. And just when it got, and so I thought it manipulated. It was really an affront to the seriousness of what had expired. So, however, it was bought and shown in Germany, and it was a catharsis.
Yes.
In Germany, the young people, as people, or teachers even. And so for many people, it opened eyes. And so, you say, okay, if it takes a TV series, it was a beginning. And so it was a real important moment, sort of along with The Nasty Girl,
yes,
the movie that you mentioned.
Yes.
And in Austria, which was always considered itself being the Nazis' first victim, it was also the young generation that finally found out that Kurt Waldheim, at the time heading the UN, was a Nazi. And his papers had been in the basement all along. So the young generation that grew up in the 60s, I think, turned around that Austria finally started considering reparations. So the movement is important. And the movement that we see today from young people, I think, is the most encouraging of all the aspects and the horror that we have to deal with.
Yeah.
That the young people, I think, really are mobilized. The anti-gun movement maybe started them.
Exactly, exactly.
That movement was so moving, and yet it didn't go anywhere. I think this time they're going to insist.
And I think so, yes. And I think, one gets well, I get demoralized when things, you know, Black Lives Matter in, you know, around in 2014, 15, and then that, you know, there was Occupy, and then they, you know, they don't get the traction they want, but actually it is a journey, and all of these things, again, I'm hopeful. I feel like we're in a different moment, but I'm
hoping to.
agree that, you know, one shouldn't get too hopeful. Okay, I think, okay, quickly, Rodney, I think you get to have the last question. Then I have to turn into a pumpkin. Hi.
Yeah, a quick question about the Truth and Reconciliation Commission idea. I'm wondering what the general conditions are that make that effective or appropriate. Obviously, moral and political will is essential. I'm seeing that I may be not being heard there. The question is, is whether what the conditions are that make the Truth and Reconciliation process effective and appropriate to the extent that it is. Obviously, moral and political will is essential, but can we say anything more beyond that? Are there other kinds of conditions that lie in addition to
last 2 months, I've lost about 20 pounds, which blows my mind. After
and specifically, I'm wondering if it could be applied, say, to Israel and the Palestinians, which would seem to me to be a very extreme challenge to that whole idea.
Well, I think there you have to have the political will on both sides. I don't see it there. Yeah. Historically, I mean, thank you. That's a really interesting question. The South African Truth and Reconciliation Commission has become a kind of landmark. And so I wrote a piece on basically, you know, certainly in the 2000s, TRCs became a kind of the thing to do. And so, I mean, they're everywhere. Peru, you know, you name it, Liberia, Kenya had TRCs. Generally, they have been the societies that have been most willing to do them are ones that are coming out of some like civil war or something really, some years of dramatic difference. I think the thing for South Africa, even though apartheid was, you know, had been there since 48, it was the terrible violence of the 1980s where the state just unleashed terror that, and I think the demographics that I think led South Africa to have a Truth and Reconciliation Commission. And actually there, the African National Congress, the ruling party, endorsed a TRC because there were some bad experiences in their African National Congress camps in Angola and Tanzania that they wanted to confess to. And so there was will on the part of the government, the ANC government, to actually have a TRC. I think it's much, back to my point about being challenging, I think it's much more challenging to have a TRC in a society like the United States, where the issues are deeply enduring and present, but aren't, I mean, I think maybe the on-screen murder of Ahmaud Arbery and George Floyd are the kind of galvanizing moments of horror that bring people to, and I think we're seeing some element of that now, but traditionally it has been more in the wake of, you know, a civil war or something like that. I mean, Canada would be the exception. So I think to the extent that one could look for somewhere to learn from, it might actually be Canada more than, you know, the classic Truth and Reconciliation Commissions. But certainly, I think you're right. The moral and political will absolutely has to be there, and that's where I really do. I'm compelled by the idea of movement that is. A number of people have indicated that we really have to think about building a movement towards some sort of truth and reconciliation, or a whole variety of truth and reconciliations for this country that might ultimately end in a formal apology. But wouldn't it be fabulous if we have let's just say things, we had Biden become president in, you know, November. it would be amazing to think of him thinking about how he could convey some form of apology as the President of the United States. On that note, thank you so much. I really appreciate it. I really enjoyed it. I'd be happy to come back sometime and talk about, other things or more.
Thank you so much for coming, Pamela. I really appreciate it. And so thank you a lot. And there's no reason that we have to end our discussion now. I noticed Denise has had her hand up and Pamela just
Sorry, Denise.
Time to go. But Denise, you can certainly go ahead and
I'm gonna have to go.
Say something.
Bye. Bye-bye, Pamela.
Yeah. Bye. I just wanted to say, I think one of the difficulties we have here with the truth and reconciliation or acknowledgement are like illustrated in The Nasty Girl. People are afraid to see what in my family or how was my family involved in that. So if you take lynchings, there's the person who's wondering, oh, was my father or grandfather in that audience? Were we part of the mob? Or you can go to Tulsa and go, oh yeah, was my grandfather one of those people? And they don't really want to know because it puts them in a very funny position. We have now people who opt out. Oh, I didn't own any slaves. None of my ancestors owned slaves. And I would say back to you, if you bought a home in Levittown, New York, like my husband's parents did, you're part of the problem because you bought a home in a place where you knew that you were explicitly excluding Black people. That makes you part of the problem. But people don't want to say, yeah, it's something personal. They want it to be distanced. And it's frightening because it asks you, who am I? And you have to examine your conscience and how do I want to go forward? And I think that underlies much of the lack of will. Whereas the younger generation doesn't seem to be limited by that, right? They are less afraid of what their past may unearth. And they typically go into it with a naivete like, oh yeah, nobody in my family was part of that. And then begin, I don't know if you watch Finding Your Roots, but then begin to see into their past and see how it's sort of intertwined with what they're discovering.
Just to respond to that, I sort of know what that's about. When I was a postdoc, I was part of an anti-apartheid group. And so we were clearly trying to work against the very bad system. And part of my feeling then, being a lot younger and more naive, was how could any white person in South Africa stay there? I mean, because inevitably, as a white person in South Africa, you're supporting that system. And it was sort of easy to see that and see how bad it was, but much harder to sort of say the same thing about whites in the US. How can you be white in the US and not be supporting the system that's there? And so I think that's part of the problem. It's a lot easier to see other people's faults than to see one's own self in that part. So I see Tiny has her hand up again.
Did you say my name?
Yes.
Oh, well, I had forgotten to mention something that, considering the way they did the reconciliation project in South Africa, what helped Germany, I think, a lot was Richard Weizsäcker. at the beginning of the 80s, was the president of the Federal Republic. And he made a distinction between national guilt and national shame. And guilt being something that especially the younger generation say, well, we weren't even born, or we didn't have anything to do with the Nazis. And but there remains a very powerful responsibility to acknowledge the shame that was done in the name of German history. So I just thought that perhaps that could help here too, because there are many people who say, well, you know, whatever, we didn't have slavery, or we weren't, the younger ones perhaps saying we weren't part of this. And it's easy to hide behind that. I don't know if that's useful or not, but it was a little bit helpful in Germany.
So other people are welcome to say anything. You can unmute yourself and you can talk either about the topic or just say hello to other people. We're at the end of our time, but it's fine to stick around, and it's also fine to make any comments about the program or just talk to each other.
This was a great program. It made me think about a lot of things, and I really liked it, and I liked the comparison with South Africa and talking about what common experiences we have when we think we don't have any. It was good.
I agree.
Me too.
I think interesting, in response to Gray's comment about South Africa, when I was in South Africa, our tour guide, who was Italian, there seems to be a large Italian group in South Africa, was a former stewardess. And she said that until people started boycotting her planes, like she couldn't understand that when she flew into an airport, people were protesting, or why people didn't like South Africa, because to her, she didn't see how they lived was wrong. Like it was so much a part of her being, of who she was. And, you know, she was relatively young, and she went to school, and she didn't interact that much with Black Africans. She didn't understand why there was this huge movement against apartheid. And I think that too is part of our experience. Another example of that is I met someone, I was born in Louisville. I met a nurse here who grew up in Louisville. We were about the same age, and I said, oh, we left because we wanted to go to desegregated schools. And she said, oh, I didn't realize our schools were segregated. Right? Because as a young kid, she lived somewhere, there were only white people, so that was always in her school. And she said to me, I didn't interact with a Black person until I went to the dentist when I was in high school, which I thought was amazing, because I don't know how she got to a dentist that had a Black person in the office. But right, you can see how your experience, especially a child, frames your viewpoint. So what you think of as just normal excludes Black people, because so many people's youth and experience that we're not in the room. And that, for us, that's the problem. When we're not in the room, nobody's thinking about us. And in that way, we have been invisible.
Yeah, I think there, Denise, you really are talking about the issue that I'm trying to think about. What I notice is that many of us who have families who are still in rural areas where they will go to school and go to church, and they do not see Black, brown-skinned, multiply racial people. And so there's not a way in which they naturally develop an interest, an embeddedness, a fascination with people who are really a significant mixture, and you have all this wonderful talent and traditions, but rather are introduced into inducted into a kind of mode of fear that when there is any kind of presence of black or brown toned or Asian or whatever, there's been an intrusion. Okay. Now, isn't that what okay, so how does truth and reconciliation work with the processes that can help us move ahead and understand this nation as a nation of multi kinds of people and traditions, and learn how to appreciate and want the richness of that? How do we nurture that?
Yeah, see, I think you're right. And you have to think about it this way. We're only 13% of the population. So it's nearly impossible to be everywhere.
Right.
Right. And so what people have are images that are gathered from the environment, right? They have what they learn in school. They have Aunt Jemima and Uncle Ben's.
Right.
They have the nightly mug shots across TV, right? And so how their opinion is formed by a bombardment of stereotypes.
Yes.
It's all they know, right? And so they can't put a real person with any of the concepts. And so you're right, their first reaction is fear, because our stereotypes are built on that concept of fear, which is in some ways innate. It's implicit, right? But man was meant to find the enemy and run from it, right? And so fear is an important motivator in how we structure our lives. So if you can make someone fearful, you can immediately cut off that contact.
It's when people of their own age and younger and older begin to have friends and see people as people rather than as a stereotype. And so there are natural sort of societal rituals, societal festivals, societal activities that nurture those kinds of experiences, and somehow we don't have enough of those, or we don't have the right kinds, or we have too many forces that are moving against them.
It's not somehow, it's intentional, right?
Yeah.
85% of minority students do not go to schools with white people in them.
Yeah.
Right?
Yes, right.
Most people live in spaces where they don't have any Black neighbors.
Yeah.
Right? And those are not accidental.
Right.
There is a historical intentionality that separates spaces.
Yeah.
You know, the Dixiecrats always said, integration will be the death of us.
Uh-huh.
Because they understood when people get to know each other as equals, they somehow don't believe all of the other crap in the environment.
Right.
So what you've said is we are intentionally structured to prevent reconciliation.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
And so we have to attack all those institutional ways. You know, I say to people, well, are you willing to move into a neighborhood with some Black people and integrate it? And I don't find many takers, right? Are you willing to put your kids in schools that are minority Black? No, they don't want to do any of those things. So no one has bought into the idea that we're going to live together, because white people like living in their separated enclaves. In fact, they were created for their comfort.
I think
Linda, if Hubert has your hand up, Linda, you can just unmute yourself and jump in.
Well, I wanted to say just a couple of things. having toured the townships of South Africa, I have never seen such really horrible living conditions or even contemplated them. And I went through Jacksonville as a kid and was horrified then. I'm not ready to look to South Africa as a model. Maybe the Truth and Reconciliation efforts are admirable, but this is a very complex situation there. And I guess I think Canada may be better. I absolutely loved the program. I thought she was wonderful, but I did feel that there's something understated about the horrors of the 80s and even into the 90s and into now. That South is still a struggle, as we are, but maybe not quite to that extent. What I wanted to say otherwise was that it seems to me one of our issues in our country is the diminishment of the arts, the lack of education and literature and reading what people have written, what Black authors have written, stories and narratives. If we're going to diminish the importance of the humanities in our education, we are losing a lot. Because sure, face-to-face confrontation is part of this, but reading and literature and being part of the world of story, the experiences of others that you get in the arts, in the humanities, this is very, very important to America, and it's certainly in jeopardy. That's all I wanted to add.
I think that we should be making more efforts to define white privilege and know how we come across to other people and understand how dumb we are about this stuff, you know, how clumsy we are about even the best intentioned of us. I think that getting along doesn't mean that we are going to be universally loved or admired just because we extend a hand. I think we have to understand what that hand means and how we're doing it, and doing it one at a time. It's just, I think it starts small. It's going to be very hard to make a big generalization. You know, it's like we've all got to put on masks in our neighborhood, and you can't expect the president to tell us, put on your masks. It's not going to work that way. It's going to work in the grocery store, and the rest of it. It's a big problem, but it's not insurmountable.
We need economic investment that is huge and considerable and has to happen on a national level. And to that end, we've got to get another administration, get people in there that are going to make a difference. And so our first act, it seems to me, is to get these dreadful people thrown out.
Yes.
On level. And if they can't be thrown out, then I'm willing to consider other options.
Speaking of which, did anybody see on CNN this series on 1968?
Yes, wasn't that wonderful?
That was astounding. I said, oh my goodness, they're running it again. I missed it the first time. So I started at midnight, and then I said, uh-oh, wait, it's hours worth of stuff, but it is just unbelievable. It's I think it's 6 hours, 8 hours long? It's really amazing, the things that happened in 68.
What, is that PBS or what? Where are you finding that?
CNN.
Oh, huh? Oh,
it's
CNN?
A CNN special.
Oh, yeah, I know what you're talking about. Yeah.
And I think they'll probably run pieces of it. You can pick it up, but yeah, it's really, really good. It's kind of a who's the guy? Ken Burns. Ken Burnsoid. Yeah.
Yeah.
Exactly. With news clips.
You do remember 1968, right, Marianne?
Yes, 1968.
You remember those events, right? Don't you?
Very, very well. Hell, you know, I was looking back on. I was working at a medical school. I was out of college. I had my master's, and I started med school in '71. So.
Yeah.
Or 72, I mean, yeah.
I was at Wisconsin in graduate school. We had National Guard in the streets, you know, tear gas in the air, IDs necessary to get into buildings where we taught our classes. It was quite a time. Where were you, Vernon?
I was just starting, I just transitioned from University of Chicago, where we lived in Hyde Park, down to Champaign-Urbana. And so then we marched to get the University of Illinois to bring in 500 African-American students from Chicago to the University
All right.
of Illinois, and marched through the streets through that time. And so started teaching in the midst of
Yeah.
Actually, when we were in Chicago, was still the Democratic Convention.
Yeah.
Time during the summer. So as well as the death of Martin Luther King Jr.
Yeah.
Really traumatic time.
Mm.
And Bobby Kennedy, of course.
Bobby Kennedy, who had come and visited Hyde Park just the fall before, and we had seen him, was also then assassinated. So
yeah,
Mm-hmm.
It was.
Yes. So I was in the streets.
All right, Denise.
I was one of those people, like we had the African-American students take over the student union. There was all that about having rifles, guns in the student union. I was not inside, I was outside.
And where were you living then, Denise? Where were you living?
I was at Cornell University. And was there, I graduated in 1970 from undergrad.
Yeah.
So I was in and out of the Black Power movement and the anti-war movement, went to the anti-war march in Washington. Man, and having the National Guard like patrolling the streets is just an incredibly frightening experience. You don't think, you know, when I think about the current round of marches and how people are being confronted by that same thing, like because it feels like the military is out there rolling in their with weapons allied against you. And in some ways, I think the difference for us in 68 was we expected that. All governments have a right to protect themselves against revolutionaries. And we saw ourselves as revolutionaries. And so that wasn't an unexpected response. I think now people are like, wait, I'm just exercising my freedom of speech and you're calling out the military against me. There is something wrong with this picture.